The Gospel according to Luke, chapter 9, verses 11 to 22. And the people, when they knew it, followed him, and he received them, and spake unto them of the kingdom of God, and healed them that had need of healing. And when the day began to wear away, then came the 12, and said unto him, Send the multitude away, that they may go into the towns and country round about, and lodge, and get victuals, for we are here in a desert place. But he said unto them, Give ye them to eat. And they said, We have no more but 5 loaves and 2 fishes, except we should go and buy meat for all this people. For there were about 5,000 men. And he said to his disciples, Make them sit down by 50s in a company. And they did so, and made them all sit down. Then he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, and looking up to heaven, he blessed them, and brake, and gave them to the disciples to set before the multitude. And they did eat, and were all filled. And there was taken up of fragments that remained to them 12 baskets. And it came to pass, as he was alone praying, his disciples were with him, and he asked them, saying, Whom say the people that I am? They answering said, John the Baptist, but some say Elias, and others say that one of the old prophets is risen again. He said unto them, But whom say ye that I am? Peter answering said, The Christ of God. And he straitly charged them, and commanded them to tell no man that thing, saying, The Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be slain, and be raised the 3rd day. There endeth our reading. Thank you, Lord. Amen. In yesterday's reading from chapter 9 of the Gospel of Luke, we were witness to Jesus sending out his 12 disciples on their first mission, their first ministry, going to villages and small towns in Galilee in the vicinity of Capernaum, preaching the gospel and driving out evil spirits and healing the sick. We were also witness briefly to the ruminations of Herod Antipas, the tetrarch of Galilee, perplexed about this new prophet from Nazareth. We know from other Gospels that he privately thought it was John the Baptist raised from the dead, John whom he had beheaded. But others were telling Herod that it was Elias that had finally come, as was prophesied in Malachi hundreds of years before. Others said that possibly it was one of the old prophets that was risen again, like Jeremiah. The reading yesterday ended with verse 10, where the 12 disciples returned from their ministries, and we have the following verse 10. And the apostles, when they were returned, told him all that they had done. And he took them and went aside privately into a desert place belonging to the city called Bethsaida. And as I mentioned yesterday, this is not the Bethsaida that was a little fishing hamlet right next to Capernaum, but a Bethsaida Julius, which was a town in the tetrarchy of Philip on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, about between 5 and 10 miles away from Capernaum. So essentially, Jesus and his disciples, as we know from other Gospels, took a boat from Capernaum to Bethsaida, but we also know from other Gospels that people were actually following them, I think following the coastline of the Sea of Galilee, and that's where the narrative in today's reading continues. And what we're about to comment on is one of the most famous miracles in the ministry of Christ, namely the feeding of the 5,000, and it's the only miracle that appears in all 4 Gospels. Strangely, though, the description of the feeding of the 5,000 is shortest here in Luke, and as we'll mention, there is a very, very large gap in the narrative that occurs after the feeding of the 5,000, and no one really knows, to my understanding, why that is. So let's follow along the verses and we'll come to all of this in due course. So the people, seeing that Jesus and his disciples were repairing to Bethsaida, followed him along the shoreline. Why were Jesus and his disciples heading for this desert place? It was because they needed to regroup. It had been a tumultuous time. This was really the end of the ministry of Christ in Galilee. We've seen descriptions of the sort of mayhem around Christ day after day of healing and teaching and disputations with Galilean religious elders and Pharisees. His disciples have come back from their first ministry. They would have been exhausted too. They needed time to regroup, and also Jesus needs to continue to teach them because he knows what's coming, and he knows that they're not ready yet to evangelize the gospel in his absence. However, they're not going to be allowed to be alone because the people are in such excitement that they follow him. And we learn here that he received them and preached to them and healed those that had need of healing. And in the Ellicott commentary, Ellicott often gives other translations of the underlying Greek, and he says that treated would actually be slightly more accurate than healing here, and it's just another indication of Luke being a physician, that he likes to use more precise language. Now, in terms of the synoptic gospels, the feeding of the 5,000 is in chapter 6 of Mark and chapter 14 of Matthew, and I'll put links to the commentaries on those readings that occurred in the January and probably the April of the gospel year. It's also covered in the Gospel of John in chapter 6, and that would have been recorded in the probably late summer, and I'll put a link to that recording as well. Now, in Mark, I think, as is quite common with some of these Galilean ministries, there's more, I think, vibrant language. And when we read through Mark, this precise juncture where Jesus decides to preach and heal the people rather than sending them away, despite the real need for a respite, there's beautiful language here. I'll read verse 34 of Mark chapter 6. And Jesus, when he came out, saw much people and was moved with compassion toward them because they were as sheep not having a shepherd. Sheep not having a shepherd. And in the commentary back in January on that particular passage there, I spoke about how little has changed in 2,000 years. We see so many of our fellow citizens, our fellow brothers and sisters, lost in this world. And that's not just an opinion, say, of mine. People tell us that they're lost. People speak of their fears, of their distrust in institutions and governments and corporations. There is a sense of being lost, and if ever there was a time where Christian evangelism and the gospel can help people rejoin the fold of humanity in their worship of God, their love of each other, now is the time. Now, this day of healing and teaching is ebbing away, the sun is setting, and the disciples come to Jesus and they say to him, we must send the multitude away into the towns and country round about. And again, Ellicott translates this as villages and farms, which makes much more sense because it is a desert place. So they're in the middle of not quite wilderness, but very rough and ready countryside, and there aren't towns, but there are villages and farms where these people can get lodging, and this old-fashioned word victuals, meaning just food and provisions. Now in John, again, interestingly, we have slightly different reading here, where it's actually Jesus himself that actually raises this issue. He says to Philip, actually one of the disciples, "When shall we buy bread that these may eat?" And in verse 6 it says, "And this he said to prove him, for he himself knew what he would do." So in John we have, it's not one of the synoptic gospels, and there is quite a different perspective on things. We believe it was written by the Apostle John, an eyewitness, the inner circle as well. He would have been probably standing close to Christ during this exchange with Philip, and remembers these words, remembers what happens next. Here in the Synoptic Gospels, it's the disciples that come to Jesus saying that there's a problem with the people needing to have provisions. And Jesus says to the disciples, "Well, give you them food to eat." And it's a sort of a strange rhetorical question. And they say, "But we only have 5 loaves and 2 fish. Unless we could go and buy food for all these people." And we learn that there are about 5,000 men and probably another several hundred or thousand of women and children in attendance as well. And again, I think it's in the Gospel of John here in verse 7. Philip answers, 200 pennyworth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may take even a little, and a penny then would be a denarii, a day's wages. So a significant sum to feed 5,000 people. Money they don't have. And this report of the 5 loaves and 2 fishes again in John is interesting, because it's there that we read of a lad, a young sort of a youth who is around, maybe who's traveling with Jesus and the disciples, possibly helping to provision them with food. But he has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes. And that's directly from verse 9 of John, but actually the translation is more like 5 barley loaves and 2 and fish relish made from 2 small fishes. And apparently fish relish was often eaten with bread in those times. The barley loaves would be the coarsest type of bread, so it's the humblest possible provision of food that would feed maybe 2 or 3 people. Now, Jesus says to his disciples, have the people sit down by 50s in a company. This is almost like a Roman organization of so many men. 5,000 is approximately a legion, actually, and sitting down by 50s. And by having them assemble in 50s, it would be obviously very easy to count them as well. And again, Ellicott points out, interestingly, that the Greek is actually more like recline or lie down, and that's the way people ate, we know. It was not sitting, but reposing. And we also learn in, I believe it's in John again, that it was springtime, there was much grass, so it would be quite a comfortable place to settle down. We also can infer that this is essentially the Passover as well, the time of the Passover. And we know this, I think, mainly from John, because of the ensuing narrative, where there are very sharp exchanges after this in the Capernaum synagogue. It was not safe for Jesus to go to Jerusalem on this particular year for the Passover, because he had been there for the festival of Purim a month before and had gotten into very, very serious dispute with the high priests and Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. This is according to the Gospel of John. So harmony between all 4 Gospels is usually quite difficult, but it is interesting and worthwhile to try to interdigitate them where we can, to get an idea of the when and where of certain events. But the reason it's interesting to think that this might be the Passover time, so sort of roughly April time, is that this is like a different form of Passover where bread is being broken, and of course this reminds us very much of that final Passover and the Last Supper and the breaking of the bread that forms the Eucharist. So it's almost like a proto-Eucharist here in a very public setting of the multitude. And we learn that everyone ate and was filled, and the fragments that remained filled 12 baskets. So presumably each disciple carried round a basket and took up the fragments. Now, in Luke, it's like a crunching gear change. It's like going from, fourth gear to second gear or something. It's just a crunching gear change here. So in between verses 17 and 18 of Luke, there are essentially 2 chapters in Mark and in Matthew of narrative in the other 2 synoptic Gospels. These cover what happened the night after the feeding of the 5,000, where Jesus commanded the disciples to go back across the Sea of Galilee, and then they struggled against the wind and were rowing the boat in the middle of the night, and Jesus came walking on the water. So that's the famous miracle of Jesus walking on water. There's another miracle feeding of the 4,000, where 7 baskets of fragments were taken up. There's the journeying into Phoenicia and the healing of the daughter of the Syrophoenician woman, which is a famous passage in Mark and Matthew. There's the teaching of the leaven and the Pharisees, which was a warning Jesus gave to his disciples concerning the desire of the Jewish elders to see a sign. And he said, beware the leaven of the Pharisees. All of that is absent in Luke, and I've not really been able to find much information about why. It's noted by all the commentators, but more as a quizzical note rather than explaining it. I think it's the Pulpit commentary, or possibly the Cambridge commentary, does point out that Luke is more of the historian here. His closest connection to all of this is via Paul the Apostle, who was neither an eyewitness, but who knew some of the apostles. Whereas Mark, we believe, is written from eyewitness account by Mark speaking to Peter himself, and Matthew, of course, the one of the apostles, and John, one of the apostles. And Luke, if he's being really, really careful, if he doesn't have corroborative information perhaps on certain events, he simply doesn't include them. And so maybe he just could not get information 30 or 40 years after the time from key eyewitnesses to feel comfortable including those episodes. So we pass quite rapidly on. It's worth just pointing out in the Gospel of John in particular that after the feeding of the 5,000 we have the following verses 14 and 15. I think these are quite important to understand the tenor of the time at the end of this Galilean ministry. Then those men, when they had seen the miracle that Jesus did, said, "This is of a truth that prophet that should come into the world," meaning the Messiah. When Jesus therefore perceived that they would come and take him by force to make him a king, he departed again into a mountain himself alone. Very, very helpful and insightful there in John to understand that the ministry of Jesus in Galilee has reached its end because he can't do any more public teaching or healing without essentially being taken by force and made a king, which is the antithesis, as we continually say throughout the gospel year, of his ministry. His ministry has to end in a non-material, non-earthly, non-power-based way. Indeed, he being executed in the most savage way that's reserved for the most despicable of individuals. I say despicable in terms of how they're viewed. Slaves and thieves would be crucified. Jesus killed in that way as the ultimate sacrifice for mankind, taking upon himself the sins of mankind. He knows that that is ahead. He cannot jeopardize his ministry through that temptation of the devil. We remember in the wilderness, all earthly kingdoms can be yours, they're mine to give, said the devil. So we're moving on then here to verse 18. This now is narrative in Mark in chapter 8 and in Matthew in chapter 16, and this is when Jesus and the disciples are venturing north. They're on the outskirts of a city in the Tetrarchy of Philip called Caesarea Philippi, and it's where Jesus turns to his disciples and says, "Who do people say that I am?" And so here we are. Interesting here that Luke alone talks about Jesus praying. I think it's nearly a dozen times in the Gospel of Luke that there'll be a phrase included where Jesus is praying prior to some action being taken. We saw that, for example, when Jesus selected the 12 disciples. He was praying that night before. So Luke very precise about the prayer time of Jesus. And he asks the disciples, "Whom say the people that I am?" And they give the same answer to Jesus that we saw the ruminations of Herod provide. The main answer being John the Baptist risen again, John having been beheaded by Herod Antipas. But some say Elias, which is the Greek form of Elijah, who was to come to make the path straight. Others say that one of the old prophets is risen again, such as Jeremiah, or one of the other Old Testament prophets, Ezekiel, and so on. Jesus looks at them in the eye. "Whom say ye that I am?" And Peter answers and says, "The Christ of God." And we can just look at slightly different variants of that. If I turn to, for example, here Mark, and I will be looking here at chapter 8 of Mark, verses 27 to 33. Peter says, "Thou art the Christ." And if I turn to Matthew, and the reason for turning to Matthew will become apparent in particular in a second, Matthew chapter 16. Simon Peter answered and said, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." Now, in Mark and Luke, after that answer, we have an agreement of this narrative. He straitly charges them, and straitly in that Old English means strictly. He strictly charges them, and very, very sternly, do not tell anyone that thing, because it would lead again to this King Messiah, this earthly forced onto a throne. It would essentially torpedo the ministry. But at the same time, in Matthew, there are a few verses which have generated libraries of discussion, and I went through them quite carefully, not the libraries, the verses, back in April time. I won't repeat that discussion right now, but it's just to mention that we have these famous verses in Matthew, verses 17 to 19, where, if I paraphrase a little bit, Jesus answers Peter, "Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah. Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven," and so on. And those verses creating a huge divide in the Christian movement between essentially Catholicism, which focuses on those verses very precisely to indicate that Peter is the rock of the church, Peter being the first bishop of Rome, the origin of the papal line, indicating that the bishop of Rome is essentially the inheritor of the rock upon which the Christian church is built, and of course other denominations, particularly in Protestant denominations, not agreeing with that interpretation of those verses. And I won't speak more about it because it's in Matthew, but the commentary there will give you a sense of other views, and also my own sense of it. But I'm not a theologian and not qualified to give any independent sort of academic expert view, but it's just my own personal view. In any case, in Mark and Luke, we don't have those verses, and we just have Jesus presumably joyous that his disciples are alert and awake to the true nature of their master, but this mustn't be spoken of. And very, very tough for them to hear now. As soon as he said that Jesus says that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected and be slain, and be raised the third day. And so he effectively bursts the bubble here that he will die in the not too distant future because of the Jewish hierarchy, and this will have come as a tremendous blow to the disciples. And in fact, not here in Luke in the immediate verses that follow, but certainly in Mark and Matthew, we have Peter again objecting very, very strongly and being exceedingly berated by Christ. And I can just maybe read that from Matthew, because we don't have that in the verses that follow here in Luke. So Jesus talks about this rejection and being killed and being raised the third day, and we have here verses 22 and 23 in Matthew. Then Peter took him and began to rebuke him, saying, "Be it far from thee, Lord, this shall not be unto thee." But he turned and said unto Peter, "Get thee behind me, Satan, thou art an offence unto me, for thou savourest not the things that be of God, but those that be of man. Those that be of men." I beg your pardon. Incredibly charged narrative there in the Gospel of Matthew. Elation with Peter at one moment because Peter acknowledges Jesus as the Messiah, and then horror minutes later when Jesus protests against this fate for Christ knowing that it's the only way and that it's only weakness and giving in to the devil's temptation to turn away from this most bitter of cups whose dregs must be drunk. But this not present in Luke in the verses that follow. So quite an interesting reading here from Luke in the brevity of the coverage of the feeding of the 5,000, the missing of essentially 2 chapters of Synoptic Gospel compared to Mark and Matthew, and again brevity in these verses of the acknowledgement of Jesus as the Messiah. But what will be coming up in Luke are the most gorgeous parables that only appear in the Gospel of Luke, and we'll see much more teaching in the chapters to come once the Galilean part of the ministry is at an end.